welcome you to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast, and we're beginning the conclusion to the book of Job, which begins in chapter 38 through 42. Most of this, except for the last chapter, is God replying to Job, and there is quite a bit to be said, and it is pretty comprehensive. Job reacts to it by repenting, and so I think he although he did not open his mouth and say anything directly that was wrong, even though he was tempted by his wife to curse God and die, as we recall, he did not do that. But there were temptations, I think, to doubt, and so I think that's what he is repenting of. But he had maintained his integrity, at least publicly and officially. But God knows his heart, he knows our hearts, and oftentimes there's a divergence in the way that we think about God and the way we should think about God. So Job goes through this. It's the culmination, but also the conclusion of his suffering, as we will see. So this profound, these chapters are quite meaningful and remind us that we are dust. As the Greeks said, we're creatures of a day. And so Job is going to be confronted with that in all of his questioning. He maintains his integrity, but it seems like there have to be times when he questioned. Christ himself questioned. He says in John to the disciples in Gethsemane, "The cup that my Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" But he had just prayed in Gethsemane that cup would be taken away from him. He prayed in an agony of sweat and sweat like blood. So the human condition is one where we know what is right to do, but the challenge is doing it right. And Christ was able to enter into all of that, not knowing in his humanity the full purposes of God and wanting to be delivered from that destiny of facing the wrath of God for the sins of his people. But in that great mystery, Christ was obedient in a way that excelled even the obedience of Job. Suffering. We are all fragile creatures, and suffering in this world can be so intense. But Christ has set forth an example, and to a lesser extent, Job too has set forth an example, and this gives us some rich meditation on when suffering comes unexpectedly into our life, that is, when it's not attributable to anything that we've done that we can think of. We're to meet it in faith and recognizing our limitations, respecting the fact that we are not able to deliver up a final judgment, and certainly we cannot summon God to our bar of justice. God appears when he appears, when he's had enough of Elihu, and he intervenes, and he does it in a remarkable way. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Why would God speak out of a whirlwind? With Elijah, he doesn't speak in the earthquake and in the trembling of the mountain and all of that. He speaks through a still small voice. And that seems inconsonant with God and all of his grandeur, as was revealed to Moses at the Mount Sinai, where Elijah found himself. God spoke to Moses, we're told, in a voice face to face. Why doesn't God speak to everyone? Why does God give a vision of himself and speak out of heaven to Saul on the road to Damascus and not speak to us and others? There are things that we cannot understand that contextualize how God manifests himself, but he speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. Now, it was a whirlwind that had taken the lives of all of his children when they were celebrating a birthday of one of them, and the whole house, the roof came down and crushed them all. So why would God pick a wind like that, a whirlwind here? The whirling, windy vortex of a whirlwind. And I think it's emblematic of a number of things, actually. Why did God manifest himself to Moses in a thorny bush? And the bush is regarded in the Bible as a tree. So why in a tree, when a tree that's filled with thorns? We know from Stephen's sermon in Acts, he uses the word for a thorn bush. So why would God appear in the fire that was not consumed of a thorny bush? And I think it's a preview of Calvary, because he says, the word of the Lord to Moses is, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cries by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And to know in the Bible is not just cognitive. It's not that he's just aware that his people are suffering, but he's entering into that suffering somehow. So emblematically, he appears, I think, as a Christophany, in a picture of the suffering that God will one day accomplish on the tree and crowned with thorns. So he's picturing himself here, I think, out of the perplexity that he himself will know when he takes on human flesh. It's a perplexity without sin. And Job is an approximation of that, but he's not fully there, because Job will have to repent, whereas with Christ there is no repentance for his own sin. So he spoke out of the whirlwind. I think that illustrates the vortex of tumult that has encompassed Job as well. His whole life is now a whirlwind of doubt and confusion and all of that. How could it not be? So God says, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? And he says that. I think that's a direct rebuke to Elihu, an indirect rebuke to the others, his so-called comforters. But who is this who darkens counsel? God is light, and he is bringing darkness, even though he thinks he's bringing light. It's quite ironic. By words without knowledge, and he would lay claim to having the wisdom of life, but God says he has no wisdom. These are words without knowledge. There's no knowledge to inform it. There's no measure of truth or falsity to make judgment. So he says to Job, now prepare yourself like a man. That is, he's appearing now before God's bar of justice. And he said, I will question you, and you answer me. So he's been questioning God's ways. So now it's time for God to question him about his ways. And he begins with this incredible rebuke. He said, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Where were you? He's explaining to Job, he's upbraiding him for the fact that Job is finite, and God has no boundaries. He has no beginning and no ending. Job has a beginning. He will have no ending. He will be awarded eternal life, but he has a beginning. And God had no beginning, so he was at the beginning and spoke it into existence. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? To lay the foundations of the earth, how in the world did they envision the cosmography back in the ancient days? There is some reckoning that they understood the spherical nature of the world. The sphere has the advantage of having the most surface area of any solid. And so there is some evidence, certainly the Ptolemies knew, that the world was spherical. But it's described as a house in the metaphors of the Old Testament. And a house has to be laid upon a temenos, a foundation of some sort, and then built up. But what is the foundation upon? For us, it's on the rock, hopefully, the bedrock. But in the ancient world, it was on the earth. But what foundation then is the earth on? It's pushing the limits of space here, even as he pushes the limits of time. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? How big is it? In the ancient world, they envisioned the earth too, like the shield of Achilles that kind of rose in the middle of it was spherical. And Oceanus, the ocean, ran around the rim. and the earth itself was an island that arose in the midst of the waters, and the high point would be the center of the shield, so it would give it a concave form, and that was the way they envisioned the cosmological representation of the earth, even as we have a sphere on an axis, 23.5 degree, I think, axis. But in the ancient world, what is he presupposing here? He's not telling him. He says, do you know the measurements? Do you know, he will say, do you know what it's rested upon? He says that, surely you know. It's kind of a mockery. He says, or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who has its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. When he said, when I laid the foundations of the earth, the language that's being used is the language that Moses uses in Psalm 90. In verse 2, he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. That's our home, even if it's a tent in the wilderness, and peripatetic. It's not to a place where they can lay foundations and settle. And so the people of God are always pilgrims. They're looking for the heavenly city, but here they, on occasion, will have to move for different reasons. But what about God? We know when we lay a foundation, we set it in the earth, and there is a cornerstone and a capstone to our building. But what about God? In Psalm 90, verse 2, Moses says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And then it talks about how he brought forth the earth, and the language that's used there is yeled. It's before you gave birth to the earth, or ever travailed to create the world. The word travail is hul, and it's the writhing of a woman in childbirth. So the image is of God giving birth to the earth. That's Psalm 90, verse 2. And then you go back to Genesis 1, I think it's 2, verse 4. It speaks of these are the Toledot, using yeled again. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth in the day that God made them, which makes him the generator, the progenitor of the earth. It's spoken of as a generation. He gave birth to the earth. We have to speak of it metaphorically. We know that God spoke it into existence, but he's using the poetry of the language. He's saying, where were you when I did all of these things? And the answer is he was nowhere. He didn't exist. So he says, surely you know, to upbraid him a bit and to make him reflect on the fact that he knows very little. We know nothing of that. We have only heard of it by a report, but there were no witnesses there to how God created the world. He says, or who stretched the line upon it, that is to mark a line so that the masonry will be straight. Who measured all of that? To what were its foundations fastened? What is the earth resting upon? And we know cosmologically it's upon nothing. It's a sphere in motion in space. But there is no foundation upon which it rests. And how is that possible? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The sons of God are normally taken to be the angels. But if that's the case, they're created on the fourth day. God made the stars also. If that imagery is to be taken seriously, the morning stars, they're created to fill the heavens with praise, and the bird and the fish to fill the earth with praise, and the cattle and men. So there seems to be something to that. It's a doxological argument. Where were you when all of this took place in the beginning of the creation? Or who shut the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? So again, we're using language of procreation here, of birth. Who shut in the sea with its doors? What doors? And the idea there is that God draws the line along the seashore. And he will say, no further will your proud waves. The waves are always coming in, that tides that bring in the waves. It's like the sea is always trying to reclaim all the earth, as it was in the beginning when the seas surrounded, girdled around the world, and prevented any life because they were salty, briny sea from emerging, and there was only darkness. But all of that is now being brought forth. He says, who shut in the sea? God did. He's the one who will draw the line along the shore and say, thus far shall your proud waves come. So they're constantly trying to overtake the dry land, but they're constantly being frustrated. It's like Sisyphus, the myth of the man rolling the stone up the hill, and when he gets to the top, almost to surmount the hill, it rolls back down. It's the same. It's a rebuke to pride, and he's rebuking the pride of the waves. Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling bands. So again, with swaddling bands, he's picking up the theme of God giving birth to the earth idea. When I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, thus far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. I remember for some years our family went to Puerto Vallarta for a vacation, and it sits on Banderas Bay, which is absolutely beautiful, surrounded by mountains on all the sides, but that beautiful bay. And I like to sit out by the sea. And I remember at the time I'd read the Republic once a year, and Socrates talks about the third wave. And I would watch for mindless hours to try to see if there was a pattern is the third wave. What is Socrates seeing that I'm not seeing? Is it the largest wave? What is it? So it's still a riddle, and shames my pride, certainly. When I said, thus far may your pride, may you come no further, for here your proud waves must stop. And I know we moved to South Florida in 2002. Today is 2024. 22 years ago we moved here, and the sea is precisely where it was when we moved, in spite of all the threats of global warming and this sort of thing, that we were going to be inundated. That has not happened. And so God's promise is still, and he's promised there will no longer be a flood to destroy the cosmic order. There may be floods, but not these kinds of floods. Thus far may your proud waves come and no farther. Verse 12, have you commanded the morning since your days began? Do we command the sun to rise in the morning? That wasn't taken for granted by some of the Mesoamericans. They would have a human sacrifice every morning to the sun god in order to bring the sunrise. They would have to command it that way. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? The dawn moves gradually along the horizon, where it will rise based upon the summer and the winter. So do we know where and the patterns can now be identified, but does the dawn know its place? Did you make it in that order and sequence, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and that the wicked be shaken out of it? It takes on form like clay under a seal. That is, it marks the stamp of the one who is sealing. The earth is the stamp of God. God made the continents and apparently tore them apart. So in the beginning there was this, it seems like scripturally there was this world island, and some historical geologists, and I guess it's theoretical and necessarily because there's no witness, no scientific method can be applied. It's all theory. But the idea is that the continents have all torn apart from themselves, and we can very easily snuggle South America up under the western part of Africa and see how there's a continuity there, and maybe all the continents would converge There are some geologists that call that original continent, the dry land moving out of the earth, Gondwana land, or Pangaea. Pangaea means all of the earth. So it's interesting, these theories and how they express themselves, but there's no witness to it. So that shames our conceit and all of our pride in scientific achievement. Some of these things, origins, are not subject to the scientific method because they're not repeatable. They can't be tested. So he says, the seal takes on the form of the clay and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the upraised arm is broken. There is no strength, and there is no light. These are mysteries, and we have to remember who we are. When Paul is discussing the nature of free will and accountability, which is his dilemma in Romans 9, how can man be held accountable if he's not free? How can God command Pharaoh to let his people go and then harden his heart so that he would not let them go? And so that's the great question that Paul is responding to in Romans chapter 9. And he asks these questions, but the last one, the ultimate question, he refuses to answer. He simply says, "Nay, but O man, who are you to bring God to your bar of justice?" There is a place for mystery. The arguments in theology are not about mystery, but how many are they and what are they? So, but there are things that are not revealed. Deuteronomy 29:29 says the same thing, the secret things of God. It's the glory of man to find them out, but some things are just not revealed. So, and he's talking about that. He's saying you don't know the context in which your suffering has taken place and for what purpose it has been ordained. Have you entered the springs of the sea? I remember several times at San Marcos in Texas, they have glass-bottom boats, and you can go out on the lake and you can see the springs coming up from the bottom of the sea, bubbling up, which is fascinating to see. Well, where does that come from? What about these underground rivers and aquifers and things of that sort? Seems to be there's a whole system of watering the earth, under the earth. Have you entered the springs of the sea, or have you walked in search of the depths? Have we been as low as the Mariana Trench? Do we know what is lurking at the very bottom of the sea? I think I've heard that we know less about what the sea is like than we know about the surface of the moon. So our knowledge is so really incredibly restricted and limited. Have the gates of death been revealed to you? What human knows what's on the other side of the grave? What is Sheol? What is it really? What is it like? Or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? When that final door is closed, is that it? Is that the end? Or can that door itself be opened by God himself? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? I think we might have a better idea of that, although I think it's theoretical. I don't know that we can imagine a circumference of like 24,000 miles with the earth. But if we did have measurement of the earth, and I think conceptually we can maybe approximate that. We've all traveled distances. But what about to the nearest star, Alpha Centauri, in our galaxy, which is 4.5 light years away? And then there's a trillion stars in our galaxy. How about all of that? Have we measured that? Certainly not. Can we comprehend them? I don't believe we can. It addles the mind to think of distances like that. It's just impossible to begin to conceive how little this project seems to be on Earth, and yet how significant it is. Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. So, and then he continues, where is the way to the dwelling of light and darkness? Where does the sun go? Why does it set in the west and then rise in the east? Where is it? The Egyptians thought that the sun died in the west, and the sunset was the blood when the serpent god attacked it in its decline and caused it to go under the earth to be buried. That was Apophis, the serpent-headed god. And so the sun then takes a journey underneath the earth and to emerge in a rebirth in the morning. And so it was a constant cycle of death and rebirth every day. And so where does the light go? I mean, when the sun is on the other side of the earth, it's all darkness. Well, where did the light go? We don't see the light anymore. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home? How would we find the darkness or the light if we're looking for it in the middle of the night? Do you know it because you were born then? Well, obviously we were not. When the earth was born, or because the number of your days is great? Is this knowledge that can be acquired by length of days and capacity of wisdom? Doesn't seem to be. So, have you entered the treasury of the snow? Interesting use of the word treasury. It's like he has storehouses. That's what a treasury is. A treasury is a storehouse. He has storehouses of snow to bring in their season. Or have you seen the treasury of hail? This frozen water. He uses it as an armory. Hail occurs, of course, one of the plagues in Egypt is the hail that falls and burns as fire upon the ground, which shows it's not natural. It's supernatural in its origin. But then in the battle of Joshua against the 5 Confederate kings of the south, led by the king of Jerusalem, God rains hail upon them from Azekah all the way to Ajalon, which is quite a little bit of a distance there. And they're heavy stones that crush the enemy. So he says, which I have reserved for the time of trouble and for the day of battle and war. And he expresses it with the hail. You read that again in Revelation. He drops these hailstones of 150 pounds or something enormous like that. By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth? How does light, it rises in the horizon in the east, and then immediately takes the wings of the dawn, as David says in Psalm 139, and it comes up almost in rays, and then it scatters, and almost immediately you can see the far horizon. How does that light travel like that so fast? By what way is the light diffused? And the east wind scattered over the earth, the east wind, and for the provenance of this book, comes out of the Jordanian steppe. And so the light brings life, but the east wind brings death. So there are a number of dimensions to this poetry. Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt? Who made the channel? And why do the channels of the rivers flow back and forth and make these grand loops, and sometimes get caught off, and there's a flood, and then there you see a loop, but it's cut off from the flow of the river, and it takes different turns. The rivers with all of these turns to them are usually quite ancient. But why is there not one path for them? Who divides that? Determines the flow of the water and so that it falls into such patterns? Or what about the path for the thunderbolt? When we see lightning in the sky, it traces out a trajectory and a path, but it's never straight. It's jagged, as it's represented in the iconography of thunder and of lightning. Who makes a path for the thunderbolt? Baal, Baal Hadad, who is the storm god in Canaan, appears with a club in one hand and a spear in the other, but the spear is jagged. And so his spear is the lightning bolt, and the club is the thunderclap. So who makes this path? Who determines how this jagged path is to come, like the jagged path of the rivers, to cause the rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness to which there is no man? Who brings the rain to the wilderness? One of the things I've learned in traveling to Israel so many times is you look at the desert and you think you're looking at nothing but an endless sea of sand. But bring a rainstorm over a desert region and immediately it turns green. Because a lot of what you look to see and you think are sand particles are not, they're seed. and just a little bit of rain will germinate and bring it to life. A wilderness to which there is no man to satisfy the desolate waste and cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass. Man can't sink a well. There's no man there, and so how does moisture get there? How does God bring it? Has the rain a father? Who causes the rain? Or who has begotten the drops of dew? Who causes these things? From whose womb comes the ice? There we look again, we see this constant metaphor of giving birth, because how we understand that people are created is in the birthing process. But what about the earth? God gives birth to the earth. He is the father of creation. And from that womb comes forth the man. Adam comes forth from the womb of the earth, so we speak of the earth as our mother, Mother Earth. He's born of that. Christ comes forth from the earth in his resurrection, fulfilling all righteousness, because he too must come forth from the earth like the first Adam. From whose womb comes the ice and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? He comes back to this metaphor of birthing, but ice is a phenomenon. And he says, who knows how do you understand the waters harden like stone? That's obviously liquid water turning to ice, and the surface of the deep is frozen. The ice forms at the top of a body of water that is freezing for a long time. The ice forms on top because when water freezes it expands, which makes it lighter, which means that the ice forms over the water underneath the ice sheet, and it can freeze to some depth, but not entirely. And so if it were not for that, if ice formed at the bottom, all life would be destroyed. But God has so made it that ice expands in the freezing process, and so it forms at the top, and it doesn't disturb the fish and all of the animal life in the waters underneath it, even in wintertime. Who did that? Who made that design? Who designed the earth to veer between 91 and 93 million miles from the sun? That if we went to 94, or if we dropped below to 90, we would freeze or burn up because this life is so fragile, or the atmosphere would be blown away in such heat, and we would have nothing to breathe. How is it that the steady state of the earth is such that it can sustain life for thousands of years? Who did that? Who planned all of that out? Then he says to Job, can you bind the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? He's talking about these constellations. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? The Greeks saw Orion as a hero with a belt, and the daggers are 3 stars. So there's some commonality, it seems like, with that understanding, and so that has informed our guess as to that this is Orion. But can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades? How do you do that? And we have, they appear to be on a flat surface, but they're many, many, many light years apart from each other and deeper in depth. So can you bring out Mazzaroth, which is basically the constellations, the 12 constellations of the calendar year that the sun travels through? The zodiac, the Greeks called it, the Mazzaroth, the Hebrews called it. Can you bring them out in their season? They come out, they appear at just the right time, according to the solar year. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Well, the ordinances of the heavens are those bodies by which we measure time. And time in the hand of God is merely a tool. We experience time going forward by measuring the days and the months, the seasons and the years by these heavenly bodies, but God can make the sun stand still, as he does for Joshua at the Battle of Ajalon, to show that he is God, just like he brought darkness over the sun and to the Egyptians to show that he is God and not Ra. He can also stop the sun to show that he is not Shemesh, the Canaanite solar deity. And he can even turn the sun backward in its dial. With Hezekiah, he brings it 15 degrees back, so he can turn time backwards, as well as running it forwards and as well as holding it still. So time is merely a tool in his sovereignty. So he said, do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? The heavens rule. By the heavens we measure our time. By the moon we have our tides. And they have influences over us. Certain bodily seasons also are determined by the moon. And how does that happen? Can we explain it? Do we understand? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? The word voice and the word thunder are the same in Hebrew. So can you lift up your thunder to the clouds and speak like at the voice at which they would obey, that water would come and cover you? Evaporation, we understand it as such a simple process, but by that means, God is able to elevate millions of tons of water into the atmosphere. And it sits there until it begins to precipitate, and then it can fall as very, very vicious storms with tremendous quantity. How does that happen? How does it remain suspended? Why is it not falling all the time? And aerodynamically, how is it that the raindrops fall to the earth and they don't strip off all the foliage from the trees? And God has put a certain dynamic in the way that the raindrops fall, where they divide at certain intervals. And by the time they come to the ground, they are very lightweight. They cause no serious harm, the raindrops, that is. So, can you send out lightnings that you may go and say to you, here we are? Can you travel on the lightning? Can you command it to express itself? Who has put wisdom into the mind? Who has given understanding to the heart? How do we know these things? Has God given us that? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can pour out the bottles of heaven? When the dust hardens and the clumps and the clogs cling together. Ironically, the raindrops are formed by particles of dust. So he brings all of that together. Who commands all of that? That it would happen at just the right season, the right time. He says, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of young lions? Who feeds them? Psalm 104 is a beautiful psalm of God and the way he loves his creation. And he's depicted there. He watches man go about his work during the day, which means he's 24/7 watching men go to work around the world, men and women go to work around the world, but we observe it as though it were night and day, so he watches mankind. But when night comes, he sees all the nocturnal animals coming out, and he then goes out and feeds them. So that too is 24/7. He delights in feeding the animals, and they seem to know no hunger, except in extraordinary circumstances. He said, can you then hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of young lions? And they're carnivores. How is that done? When they crouch in their dens or lurk in the lairs to lie in wait, does he not bring the prey and enable them to continue? Who provides food for the raven? The unclean raven. And the raven will become an emblem of God providing food for the prophet in the days of Elijah. He feeds the prophet with a raven, which is black and unclean, not the dove, but with the unclean raven, he feeds his prophet with, and then that prophet is being taught not to despise that which is unclean, because he's on his way to Syrophoenicia, where the Canaanite woman, who would be regarded as unclean, is going to feed him. So God has a purpose in everything under heaven. Who provides food for the raven when the young ones cry to God? And it's looking at the nest, and the raven is bringing food for the young. Who provides that food for the raven when its young cry to God? and wander about for lack of food. If they have no food, what purpose is God accomplishing in that? It seems contrary to his creative order. So all kinds of questions are being raised in this opening to God's response to Job. He's telling him, he's reminding him of how little he knows. We have more indications of how little he knows because we've learned something about the size of this cosmos in which we find ourselves. We've now estimated that there are 100 there are a trillion stars in some of these galaxies, and there are potentially trillions of galaxies. Many of what we look at night in the heavens and see, we think are stars or galaxies, actually, just more remote. It's so much bigger than Job would very likely have had any indication about. So what is man? I guess what the question that comes really is, what is man that God is even mindful of him? But God is very much mindful of Job and sees him for his exemplary righteousness and knows that he will persevere him through his doubt to a place of deeper faith, which we'll see when we get to chapter 42.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. If you enjoyed this message, please be sure to like and subscribe to one of our channels so that you never miss an episode. We'd appreciate it if you could also leave us a review. You can find us on drwarrengage.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support the podcast and gain access to exclusive offers and content from Dr. Warren Gage, please visit our Patreon account at patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. We hope you join us next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast.